85 years this Easter since the Rising, which is seen as the event which led to the founding of this state. What sort of people were they, the leaders of 1916? What sort of Ireland did they envisage? Classless, socialist? And did they unleash a physical force genie which we've never been able to put back into the bottle? Ruth Dudley Edwards, biographer of Pearse and indeed Connolly. Ruth, if one was to ask you in a few words, just quickly to say what sort of people they were, what would you say?
I'd say most unhelpfully that you can't say they. They were an extremely motley crew.
Padraig Yates, what name would you pin on them? Radical?
No, but they were Fenians, and they were revolutionaries, and they believed that if they had the will and they had the plan, they could achieve what they wanted. And I suppose we have had to live with that ever since. They came so close to success, and they did succeed at one level, but they left us with this terrible problem afterwards.
Brian, how would you describe them? Brian Lenihan.
Yes, I think they were part of an underground which had existed in Irish life for a long time and which came to the surface expressing different ideas, social ideals, cultural ideals, and took an opportunity that they saw existing at the time to make a bold stroke.
Mitchell McLaughlin, chairman or chairperson, should I say properly, of Sinn Féin. How would you describe them?
Yeah, well, I think they were very much part of a tradition which already existed in Ireland and which continues to exist. And really, they're all different personalities, and clearly they were very gifted people in different ways. My view is the real question is were they right? And I feel strongly that they were.
Ruth, to return to you, I mean, one of the things you hear said in this country all the time, you know, was it for this the men of 1916 died? Were they radical? Were they left-wing? Did they foresee a classless society?
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be difficult about this, but there isn't a they. Really, Tom Clark, the old Fenian, who had never got over his terrible time in jail and who sat conspiring in his tobacconist's shop, didn't actually have anything in common with Patrick Pearse, except a very narrow ground. James Connolly, the lifelong socialist, wholly different tradition, wholly different background, wholly different class, wholly different vision. They were all terribly different. And, I mean, one of the great interesting questions is, what would have happened if they had survived? I think Pearse was always of the view, and so were others, that he would have been the first to be shot by his own comrades. Connolly would probably have been the second.
Padraig Yates, but I mean, we had this coming after another big event on the streets of Dublin, which indeed you've written about, the 1913 lockout. To what extent did that influence what happened in 1916, or the people who were the leaders?
I think it influenced it in a very big way. I mean, you've got to remember that only the previous year, Carson had torn up the political rule book by saying he would resist home rule by force, and literally cutting the ground from under the constitutional nationalists. So there were people of Pearse's generation who suddenly had to think about where all this was going and where any attempt to develop Irish sovereignty was going and how they were going to achieve it. And then on top of that, within a few months of that happening, you had Dublin erupting into chaos, and conditions in Dublin, living conditions, were Asiatic basically, because the death rate in Dublin was the highest in Europe, and it was as high as some cities like Calcutta. So you had this appalling misery, and Dublin in those days was very small, so you couldn't live in Dublin, you couldn't walk or work around Dublin without seeing the poverty on the streets. You just couldn't avoid it. People like Pearse were therefore faced with other alternatives. They had to pick sides, not just in terms of a national movement, but social movements and what sort of Ireland they wanted to come out the other side. And my own feeling is that, in fact, Pearse and Connolly were very different, were soulmates almost, because if you read Connolly's speeches in the lockout and you read the sort of articles Pearse was writing in Irish Freedom, Connolly quite frequently, maybe subconsciously, maybe consciously, lifts up imagery from Pearse and uses it in his speeches on the streets. And they were both brilliant propagandists. They were both very impractical people. Connolly has this image of being very down-to-earth trade unionist. He was actually a hopeless organiser. His great asset was his ability to write, as it was with Pearse. And they could have fallen out badly, but they seem to have formed a sort of a bond in the last couple of months before the Rising. And I imagine all these people had a project, and they were bonding into this project together. And I think they knew they were going down when they went into it. And despite their differences and despite the disparities between them, I think they all knew exactly what they were doing and what they hoped to achieve. And I suppose from their point of view, they achieved far more than they could ever have dreamt of.
Do you think that, Ruth, that Connolly and Pearse did affect one another to that extent? I mean, do you see Pearse as having been affected by Connolly's socialism?
Yes, I think he was affected in the sense that Pearse had led a very bourgeois life. He really had no idea of the poverty in Dublin, none, until the strike and the lockout. He began to develop some faint sense of it. He was a very compassionate man, but at the same time he was a man who would sacrifice himself and everybody for the cause or the crusade of his time, whatever it might be. He was a man who, for instance, didn't ever understand why people in the west of Ireland might want their children to learn English so that they could get a job abroad, because there was no hope for them. He didn't understand those things. He didn't understand the practical concerns of ordinary people with wives and families. Having said that, Connolly had a wife and family, and a fat lot of looking they got. But, but certainly, yes, he was made more aware by Connolly, and his rhetoric was altered. But that was a very superficial thing. That was comrades in arms a few months before going out together to sacrifice themselves or whatever. They all had different projects in any long-term sense.
Yes, they all had different projects, but there was one common element I think we've overlooked so far. There was a world war on. And if you look at the political education of the Irish people in the 19th century, the Young Ireland movement, the Fenians, the Irish Party, these movements all took place in relatively peaceful times on the international side. There wasn't a war between Britain and any other country in progress. And in a way, what was taught by those movements, from God Save Ireland back through the Fenians and back to the nation, did logically result in what happened in 1916, I would maintain. Because once Britain found herself in an international war, there were bound to be some who said, strike a blow for Ireland. That was inevitable from the kind of teaching that had preceded the war for a period of 70 or 80 years. So it wasn't something that I think happened just out of the blue. And I think sometimes nowadays people are inclined to think 1916 is somehow unique in the way it happened. It wasn't that unique really when you look at what was happening all over continental Europe at the time.
You mean in terms of people striking out for nationalist causes?
Yes, but also, and of course many nowadays cannot comprehend Pearse's writings in relation to the blood sacrifice. And yet there's, in contemporary European poetry, there are many expressions of a similar sentiment on the part of combatants in the trenches. So in a sense they were part of their cultural world and part of the contemporary scene. It wasn't that unusual what happened.
Yes, there was a sort of an Edwardian notion of sacrifice that comes through, what would it be, Rupert Brooke?
Yes, Rupert
poetry.
Brooke, yes. And Francis Ledwidge, of course, in our own writing on fighting in the trenches.
Yes, and Pearse and Connolly on the war, I mean, it took them differently again. It drove Connolly almost insane to see people leaving the slums and joining up just to get the King's shilling for no other reason. That horrified him. And in Pearse's case, it was almost an envy of the people who were going and sacrificing themselves in Flanders. He wanted to be one of them, but he wanted to do it for his own cause.
Mitchell McLaughlin, what sort of Ireland do you think they envisaged? I mean, was the radicalism a sort of a surface thing, or did it go deeper?
No, I think it went very much deeper, and I think that we've described some of the context, and we can't ignore the internationalist dimension of Connolly's politics, and he was very aware of the revolutions in other parts of Europe. I think that the proclamation itself is the lasting testimony to the shared vision. And it is, in fact, a very powerful document of its time, which has resonance even now. It was a very progressive statement of social and economic imaginings for the type of Ireland that they believed could be created. So I think they had a very distinct political project. Whether they believed they could militarily defeat the greatest empire the world had ever known is a side issue. They stuck for the idea, they believed in the idea, and they understood the idea.
But was the proclamation radical because Connolly would have insisted on some quasi-socialist element being included before he'd have agreed to it?
Well, I think that you know, and Seamus Heaney in more recent times has dealt with this issue of hope and history rhyming. I think that there were a number of very significant influences which came together at a particular moment in history. The result, I believe, was a new beginning, a new opportunity, in pain, in tragedy, but nonetheless a new beginning, a new opportunity for the people of this island.
Did they want, Ruth, for this rising to be a success or to be a failure? I mean, certainly reading Pearse, being very conscious of the sort of sacrifice theme that ran through much of his writings, one wonders whether he always wanted it to be a glorious failure.
I think he always, well, I think over the last few years of his life he wanted martyrdom. I don't think there's any doubt about that, for himself. And one of the criticisms one could level at him is that it's all very well to decide that you want to do that yourself, but to bring people into it who don't realise what's happening to them and to cause the deaths of large numbers of civilians is an entirely different matter. He didn't expect it to succeed. I don't think it wasn't part of his agenda. He would strike the blow, he would go forth, he would die, and somehow he would redeem Ireland, and out of this a phoenix would rise or whatever. Connolly at the end realised it couldn't succeed, but he had had his moments of hope. Tom Clarke and Sean McDermott, there were moments they thought it could. Certainly there were.
And when they thought that they could bring McNeill with them, that it could actually be a more concerted effort than in the end it was.
Yes. I mean, some of the... remember, there is this thing in Catholicism about the concept of the just war, that you're not actually supposed to get involved in anything unless you think you can genuinely win. So there would have been very devout Catholics among them who would have thought it would be wrong to be striking a blow purely symbolically.
Would it have worried Tom Clarke?
No, that wouldn't have worried Tom Clarke.
No, I wouldn't have thought
Tom
so.
Clarke just wanted to get his own back.
For what had happened to him.
Yes, and other people like him.
Yeah.
I think that that doesn't really do justice to someone who had devoted their life to a vision. I don't think he was motivated by revenge. I think he did have a very clear vision, and his life reflects that he had this clear motivation. He did suffer terribly, but he certainly wasn't driven by, he wanted revenge, and that's why he turned up, or he associated himself with the Rising in Dublin.
I don't accept that Patrick Pearse led people to death or caused civilian casualties, because fundamentally, I don't think he caused the Rising. In fact, Tom Clarke asked Pearse to give the oration at the O'Donovan Rossa funeral, and in a sense, he was used by a Fenian element within the conspiracy as a good frontman, because he was a respectable figure in Dublin society, because he was a headmaster of an avant-garde.
He wasn't a jailbird
school.
like Tom Clarke, and he wasn't a socialist like Connolly.
He hadn't a revolutionary past, and he hadn't a syndicalist or trade union past, correct. And I think Pearse and the movement that organised the insurrection had a mutual interest to that extent, and it was realised through the Rising itself. But on the wider question, I would come back to the international element. Connolly believed that by making this example in Dublin, you would deter the casualties. He somewhat naively believed that the British wouldn't use artillery because they were a capitalist power in reducing the Rising, which of course was falsified.
Why would he have thought that?
Well, he thought that they wouldn't destroy buildings, that property wouldn't be damaged by a capitalist
I think
power.
there's also a very important point, though, which is very strong throughout the 19th century, but particularly amongst conspiratorial groups like say, the Bolsheviks or the Narodniks or the Fenians, of propaganda by deed. And I think that was part of the agenda as well. There was a feeling that by striking a blow, even if it's futile in itself, if you keep the tradition alive, or if you win more people to the cause, that in itself is better. You better go with a bang than with a whimper. And I think the other very interesting thing, which people tend to forget about 1916, is that it was meant to be a countrywide rising, but the one area of the country that there were no operational plans for was the north, because I think the IRA in the 50s campaign did the same thing as well. There was a very serious realisation that if fighting broke out in the north, it would very quickly degenerate into tit-for-tat,
into
sectarian killings or ethnic cleansing. And I think that was a very serious concern for the 1916 leaders, which has been forgotten since.
But I mean, from what you know, Padraig, was it perhaps finally because there was no other option, the intent that this would be a glorious failure? Was there ever a time when they believed that McNeill could be brought with them into an insurrection other than in a situation where conscription was imposed? Because I think his view always was that the volunteers were a defensive force and they would be brought in that situation. Was there ever a real belief that there would really be a concerted insurrection with all the volunteers involved and McNeill behind them?
Absolutely. I think again, with the history tends to play tricks on us, but because Germany lost 2 world wars, we tend to think the Germans were always going to lose. But in both world wars, and particularly in the first one, and particularly in 1916, there was a very serious prospect of a negotiated peace, and Germany was in a very strong position. And if the guns had landed, McNeill would probably have gone along with it. And I think there would have been a rising, much more serious one. And as Ruth has said, Pearse might well have been one of the very first casualties of that rising. But there would have been a much more serious effort. Now, in that situation, we would have been in probably a much worse situation. Ultimately, we were very lucky to escape as lightly as we did in 1916 as a society. But even to contain the consequences since has taken the full force of two governments, as we've seen it with recent events again. So, no, I think there was a very real prospect of success in 1916. If the guns had come ashore, if McNeill had come over, there would have been success in the sense there would have been widespread fighting. They would still have been defeated.
But that was a huge if. McNeill was never going to come on board unless the issue was conscription. If conscription had been imposed, then McNeill would have. But he never would have otherwise. Because again, he would have thought it was unjust.
I think if the guns were there, it would have been a fait accompli.
But there was an inner cabal at work who were
That's right.
determined to have a rising and determined to put on a demonstration during this Great World War. It was felt that every other country, even Pacific countries like Italy, which habitually revolted at the idea of war, got involved in the First World War to aggrandise their national position. We didn't have a strong international organisation then, so nationalism was all and sovereignty was all. And why didn't Ireland have sovereignty? The politicians hadn't succeeded in implementing the Home Rule Act before the war, and of course Redmond was very unfortunate in that he miscalculated on the length of the war. He believed the war would end very quickly, and then he was left committing himself to a war which couldn't be ended and which was resulting in a huge loss of life. There's a lot of evidence that there was huge disillusionment with Redmond before 1916 took place, particularly in the countryside.
There was also at that time
Yeah.
existing evidence of collusion between senior British establishment figures and the Unionists to subvert any possibility of a democratic outcome. So I think that the rising itself became inevitable in those circumstances. The extent of it was almost down to accident rather than the design, and we could speculate forever whether McNeill would have agreed or would have been drawn into the conflict. In my view, it would have been much more widespread, and no one, McNeill or otherwise, would have prevented that happening had the wherewithal been available.
We've also left out America. Don't forget Irish America, which were always there goading. I mean, they're there forever with us, aren't they?
And which, to a certain extent, they had radicalised Pierce.
That's right. When Pierce went to America, they deeply
there.
radicalised him, and that was a hugely personal thing for him. Those people sitting there, the armchair generals saying, you'll never do it.
Yeah.
You'll never do it. And Pierce saying, I will.
Can we talk about Pierce as the myth maker? May be a slightly cruel word to use, but he did do all the writing. And if one looks at even the year before the Rising, at what he wrote, at the sort of poems he wrote, it was almost as though he was writing the play even before it had come to its proper conclusion. Does this mean in the end, Ruth, that Pierce is remembered because he wrote the record? You know, is that the lesson we learned from history? Whereas Clark, as a natural conspirator, was a man who kept out of the limelight and is almost forgotten.
It was a large part of the reason why he was remembered, that he wrote it. And that he took it to the level of even writing a poem for his mother to recite when her two boys had been executed. I mean, it was an extraordinary, the detail he went into in this. He wrote something to justify it to himself. He wrote what was virtually a barrister's statement of why it was justified, with all the precedents there. He put it all in historical context. He got the rhetoric right. He was an utterly superb propagandist. But as well as that, he was just right to be the figure because he was a good Catholic boy. His mummy loved him. It was doubly heroic that he and his brother were killed. He suited the Ireland that came after the Rising. He suited independent Ireland. Respectability was all. Didn't have anything to do with Marxists like Connolly and Tom Clark, who knew what. Except that Mrs. Tom Clark was extremely upset that the Pierces were getting all the attention.
That they had taken over the Rising.
That's right.
And most IRB families, in fact, believed the same thing. Mitchell, for you as a Republican, who was your hero from 1916?
Well, I think the two icons as I was growing up, and it wasn't a particularly Republican upbringing that I had, was Pierce and Connolly, and my direct influence came from Connolly's writings and teachings.
And you would have read them when? At what age?
As a teenager, as someone who was becoming politically aware, as someone who felt that there were questions at that stage that I hadn't a clue what the answers were, and I found Connolly much more inspirational and valuable than Pierce, I must say.
Well, One of the questions that's always asked is as to whether 1916 unleashed a physical force tradition that we've never actually been able to a genie that we've never been able to pull back in the bottle. I mean, as far as you're concerned, and the Provisional Republican movement were concerned, you took your legitimacy, did you not, from 1916 and from the proclamation?
But I think in 1916, Pearson, Connolly and MacDonagh, all took their legitimacy from the generation before, from the Fenians, and you can go right back to 1798, to Wolfe Tone's definition of Irish republicanism. So I think that there is a continuity, and people attempt, I think, to to compartmentalise the experience. So the physical force tradition existed, really, even earlier than 1798. But if we're talking about Irish republicanism, there you have the definitions, and there also at the same time you have the example of physical force resistance to British rule in Ireland.
Isn't this true, Brian Lenihan? I mean,
I think it's a mistake to draw this very sharp distinction between the parliamentary tradition and physical force tradition. It suited our purposes in the 1970s and 80s because of what happened in Northern Ireland. The unofficial anthem of the Irish Party was God Save Ireland, and it celebrated the death of 3 men on a British gallows tree, as I recall it. So that tradition of respect for the physical force tradition was there in all Irish nationalism before 1922. It wasn't something that was unique to the Republican tradition.
Yeah, but I'm not. But post 1922,
GPO, Pearson,
we
Desmond
have
Fitzgerald were
parties
speculating
like
about setting up a monarchy.
Parties like yourselves and Fine Gael, who try to draw a line and say, we were part of Sinn Féin and we were part of the founders of the state. But, this stuff that's been going on in Northern Ireland, the Provisional IRA's campaign, that has no legitimacy.
Well, I think, and here I would have a difference with Mitchell, I have to say. I grew up being indoctrinated in the theory of Pearse. Later I read Connolly, and I must say I found him very congenial, and I came to respect both. But I didn't see their application to the circumstances of Northern Ireland, and to the violence which broke out there after 1968, because of the communal character of the violence there. You had 2 different communal groups at odds with each other in Northern Ireland, and the whole 1916 theory didn't seem to fit that problem, and its appropriation by one side didn't advance the case or the issue any further.
Was this special pleading, Ruth, Dudley, Edwards? I mean, isn't it true that to a certain extent 1916 was the inspiration for what the Provos were doing in the north?
It was the justification. I mean, I think we have to take a long, hard look at it and say that what happened in 1916 was that a group of conspirators in a democracy took it upon themselves to decide that a revolution was necessary despite it not being the will of the people. They were entirely anti-democratic. They were then, the mantle of these people was stolen by De Valera, who had Mrs. Pearse by his side. It was stolen by the Republicans of the Civil War. Fianna Fáil then owned the Pearses and owned 1916 until very thoughtlessly the IRA insisted on snatching it back. And so the Provos owned Pearse and Connolly all through the 70s and 80s. Until, as Danny Morrison said in that programme the other night, Pearse was a very useful person for the Provos when they were making war, not so useful when they're trying to make Pearse. So now the real IRA have them. And this will go on and on and on until we get rid of deal with that tradition in Irish history.
And
well,
indeed,
of course, I radically disagree with this, because the title deeds of the democracy that existed in this country in 1916 were fundamentally flawed. They were title deeds based on conquest. And that's why a rising took place in 1916.
You were on very dicey ground,
to take a bold strike against the force that maintained that conquest and enable the Irish people to have sovereignty themselves, to establish an Irish democracy. The democracy that existed in 1916 was not an Irish democracy. Our representatives had to go to Westminster, plead our case in Westminster, and be permanently outvoted there.
so therefore it was all right to be undemocratic.
From 1886, enlightened British statesmen like Gladstone believed we should have home rule. The British political system was not willing to concede that.
But Brian, you seem to be making the case for Mitchell and his chums.
I'm not making the case for Mitchell and his chums, because I'm
They
saying
could argue
that
exactly the same thing.
there was a problem in Northern Ireland where there was a difference about what nation they belonged to, about what community they identified with. But for the greater part of Ireland in 1916, the British conquest was not accepted as a valid conquest. And that's why 1916 struck such a strong chord with the people.
Again, like Ruth, I'd have to disagree with you there. I mean, the fact is that tens of thousands of Irish people, of Irish men, signed up Yeah, and fought for Britain. It was partly in order to demonstrate to Britain that they could be good British people. It was partly to demonstrate their commitment in a war, in the hope that they'd be rewarded afterwards. And you can certainly argue that Carson changed the rules of the game irrevocably in 1912. But I don't think you can possibly argue that 1916 was expressing the democratic will of the people. What it was doing, and I think it was extremely seductive, the real thing about 1916 was that it showed people who were marginalised, who were outside the system, if you are willing to make the commitment, if you've a plan, if you're willing to go down the line all the way on it, you can achieve things. And that has been the mirage which has sucked in generation after generation of young people. I think one of the very interesting things, if you look at Pearse and look at Connolly, from about 1913 onwards, when they're looking for the source of the problem in Ireland, when they're looking at the deprivation, the poverty, the bad housing, the unemployment, the exploitation, the common denominator in what they're saying is it's all stems back to foreign domination. And that was in a remarkable way. What happened then, and it's happened ever since, is that poor people in marginalised communities throughout this island have seen, well, you know, the only people who ever got results were the people who went out and fought in 1916, fought in 1919 to 21, fought in the Civil War, and so the tradition goes on. And I suppose, like Mitchell, you know, I grew up in that tradition
you regret?
as well.
I mean, is it a tradition we could have done without, Patrick?
I don't know, to be honest, because if I say you regret it, then you have to regret a certain part of your own life. But I must say that one of the reasons why I wouldn't have gone the way that Mitchell would have gone and the Provisionals would have gone was a sectarian thing, that I didn't see any connection between republicanism and being associated with a particular religious denomination or tradition. For me, republicanism was a secular tradition. That was the whole point that made it different from the denominational politics which dominate our society.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me say, just that's a statement I can agree with, but just to go back to, and we've touched on some of them already, to the period and that sequence of events, you know, and you can nearly kind of start with the lockout in Dublin and work your way through. And there is the little matter of the 1918 election result. And we see then just how, you know, the Democrats dealt with that particular issue. So I think that in a sense, those who argued that there was no democratic process that they could turn to were certainly vindicated by the reaction of both the Unionists in the North and the British government to the 1918 general election. So just to jump forward then, you know, because I do actually, you know, subscribe very strongly to the point that you've just made. You know, Republicans have tried on numerous occasions to deal with this issue through a democratic process, through peaceful process. The civil rights movement. You know, Republicans by their nature were directly involved in the civil rights movement, which was categorised as a Republican plot and which was dealt with in a very summary fashion and violent fashion by the Stormont regime.
Mitchell, the bombing campaign of the early 70s did pretty well for the civil rights movement.
No, Olivia, you really have to deal with what happened. And, you know, as someone who was there, I mean, in October the 5th, 1968, there was no bombing campaign when the RUC got stuck into us in Duke Street. You know, on Bloody Sunday, there was no bombing campaign to justify what the British Paratroop Regiment did. Now, did that have any effect on people's attitudes towards political process and peaceful process after? I think it did have a very direct, you know, effect. And I think numerous examples of that. And I think even here in this state, and you know, the most recent revelations about the arms trial and the Dublin Monaghan bombing, all of that fed into that.
Yeah, let's take the arms trial, because to a certain extent the arms trial and what happened in 1969 was an example of the sort of pressure from that physical force tradition, the importation of arms, possibly for use across the border in Northern Ireland. We've been told this week, Brian Lenihan, that in fact one of the crucial pieces of evidence in that trial would seem to have been tampered with in order to remove the suggestion that the Minister for Defence knew and was involved in the importation of those arms. Now, are we going to get an inquiry into that?
Well, I would very much like to see an inquiry into that issue, and I would welcome an inquiry into that whole question.
And I gathered, by the way, sorry to interrupt you, that the Taoiseach said in the Dáil today that John O'Donoghue, the Minister for Justice, would be giving a full statement about the Michael Heaney's primetime programme after the Easter holidays.
But we had two very comprehensive inquiries in 1970 in the form of two trials. And I think anyone who carefully reads the records of those trials and the documents that were released earlier this year from the archives, they clearly point in the direction that there was considerable official concern in the 1960s about what was happening in Northern Ireland, and that certainly at the level of contingency planning, the option of providing arms and munitions was looked at in government circles.
Yeah, but I mean, there's the specific question of whether the Minister for Defence and indeed the Taoiseach behind him knew about and were involved in the importation of arms.
It would appear from the documentary records.
Would it shock you if that were the case?
No, it wouldn't shock me at all. No, it wouldn't surprise me at all if were that the case. Because I think we're, again, as with 1916...
And all the minuet that's been danced since, in terms of, you know, those who were clean boys at the time of the arms trial and those who were bad boys at the time of the arms trial, that doesn't matter?
Well, of course it matters. And clearly, I have a particular view about those events which perhaps never accorded with the orthodoxy of some. I mean, to my mind, many journalists have persistently maintained the theory, even after the archives were produced earlier this year, that there wasn't a high level of official awareness in the matter when clearly there was. And that's what the documents have shown.
You think?
And I don't want to personalise it in terms of individuals
Jack Lynch
involved.
Knew?
I think there was either a high degree of awareness or a willful blindness to what was going on the part of many in the government at the time. And I don't believe that it is fair to say that there was that there was a criminal conspiracy, as was alleged later that year. I think Jack Lynch was perfectly entitled to remove ministers who he had no confidence in. But I believe the strategy of following on that, of prosecuting individuals for alleged breaches of cabinet misunderstandings, was a faulty one. Because you can't have a conspiracy.
It was wrong.
It's wrong because you can't have a conspiracy when you have a government. And government is meant to operate together.
And do you think then that the scapegoating of people like Captain James Kelly and to a certain extent Neil Blaney and Charlie Haughey-Since was wrong?
Well, I certainly think that the scapegoating of Captain Kelly was wrong, because Captain Kelly was a uniformed officer in the Irish Defence Forces whose mandate and commission came from a cabinet decision. And it was wrong that he was put on trial, and I have always felt that. And I am glad that the facts are coming to light in that respect.
Would you like to see him compensated in some way?
Well, I don't think he's looking for any compensation. I don't think he belongs to that school of activity. At least I hope he doesn't. But coming back to the more general...
You mean like other members of the Department of Defence or other employees of the Department of Defence?
Well, his hearing seemed to be very good from what I could see the other night, so I don't think he's much options there.
Can we move on to the question, Ruth Dudley Edwards, of whether we would have, and maybe this is a rather Redmondite point of view, would we have achieved independence anyway, even without 1916 and some of the forces that it unleashed?
I really don't like speculation of this kind much. I mean, I feel subjectively that yes, things would have been much better without the, once again, physical force being used. I think we would have got to a happier place. I actually care desperately about all these people who are sacrificed in the name of something nebulous by people who are convinced they know best. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're talking about civilians in 1916. The poorest people in Dublin and Moore Street being sacrificed. They didn't know what was happening. The people, the innocent victims of the Provos, the innocent victims of the real IRA. It's all the same thing as far as I'm concerned. And I'm perfectly prepared to believe that there's a huge amount of self-sacrifice and sincerity among people who get involved. I have friends who got involved in that in their teens. I understand that. But I think it is the most incredible tragedy and waste, and it's time that we actually grew up and rejected it.
Mitchell McLaughlin.
Well, I mean, I think we have to simply take a look at the history of the British government in this country. We also have to take a look at the history of colonial powers anywhere. To stand up and say, you know, I believe in independence is a legitimate statement. The response of those who would have a responsibility to meet that then determines how people follow through. And I think that...
would we have achieved independence without 1916 and achieved it without the tradition of militarism and indeed the bitterness in Northern Ireland that we now have?
No, one has to just look at the experience of the Irish National Party. Look at the 1918 result. Look at the way in which the British government.
What about looking at the way that Britain has got out of absolutely everywhere?
I listened carefully to your reference, and you talked about the IRA and the real IRA, and of course there has been casualties and people killed by those organisations. But the loyalists and the British,
tonight, the real IRA saying that they're going to continue their campaign of violence in Northern Ireland. I mean, where does it stop?
Well, I mean, I just wonder what that statement means, given their recent activities. My view is that we can address now. I think we have now achieved a situation where the British government has indicated through the Good Friday Agreement that they are prepared to allow the people of this island to exercise self-determination. That was a historic breakthrough. It was not available in 1916, and it certainly wasn't available at any time since.
Would we have got independence without 1916?
I don't think we'd have got the amount of independence we have. But, of course, I do accept that if Gladstone had got his way in 1886 and brought in Home Rule, we might have had a more peaceful evolution. We can't reverse events, but what we can say...
Padraig.
No, again, sorry.
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
Padraig.
1916, I think, was essential to getting the type of independence we ended up with. I think otherwise we would just be a sub-region of Britain. Certainly I don't think we'd have had the economic development that we've had if we had stayed part of a British state. And I think that the big lesson is, again, going back to Carson and the House of Lords, these people, and the Unionists as well, have lost everything by resisting change. There has to be change. It's a question of finding the right formula. As Mitchell just said, if we don't find the right formula, people can get back in the trenches and can start killing each other again. But they're the options.
That's all from us. If you want to contact us, we're later@rte.ie. Until the same time next week, goodbye.
Well, here's the lineup for Good Friday night here on One. At 6:30, 1,000 actors, singers and dancers from Kerry present the story of salvation in a colourful pageant from Mill Street in County Cork. That's followed by comedy when Yvonne is asked to judge a book prize in Goodnight Sweetheart. Dolores is finding it hard to avoid